March 1941. The Luftwaffe owned the night sky over Britain. Every evening, waves of Heinkel and Dornier bombers crossed the Channel unopposed, reducing British cities to rubble, whilst RAF fighters groped blindly through darkness, finding nothing. Losses were unsustainable. Britain was dying one night at a time. Then, on one freezing March evening, 6 German bombers vanished in 90 minutes. The Germans never saw what killed them. Neither did most of Britain. This is the story of the Silent Hunters. The operations room beneath RAF Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory smelled of cigarette smoke, sweat and desperation. It was 21:30 hours on 15th of March 1941, and Squadron Leader James Rawnsley stood before a plotting table watching coloured markers represent death approaching from across the Channel. Each marker was a German bomber. Each bomber carried enough explosives to obliterate a city block. Tonight, like every night for 8 months, they would reach their targets unopened, drop their loads, and return home for breakfast. The statistics were catastrophic. Since September 1940, the Luftwaffe had flown over 30,000 bomber sorties against British cities during night operations. RAF night fighters had managed to intercept and destroy fewer than 70 aircraft. That represented a 0.2% success rate. At this rate of attrition, Germany could continue bombing Britain indefinitely, whilst the RAF burned fuel, exhausted pilots, and achieved nothing. London, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, each had burned. Over 40,000 British civilians were dead. The Blitz was systematically destroying Britain's industrial capacity, crushing civilian morale, and the RAF could do nothing to stop it. The problem was brutally simple. Human eyes cannot see in darkness. A fighter pilot flying at 300 miles per hour through pitch-black night sky had perhaps a 5-second window to visually acquire a target, identify it as hostile, maneuver into firing position, and engage before the bomber disappeared into darkness again. The mathematics were impossible. British fighters were fast, well-armed, and piloted by brave men who flew night after night, knowing they had virtually no chance of finding anything. They were hunting invisible targets in 3-dimensional darkness across thousands of square miles. It was like searching for a single black marble in a coal mine whilst blindfolded. Previous attempts to solve the problem had failed comprehensively. Ground controllers tried vectoring fighters toward reported bomber formations using verbal directions. Turn left, climb to Angels 15, target should be 2 miles ahead. But by the time the fighter reached the coordinates, the bomber had moved. Some pilots reported seeing exhaust flames from bomber engines and managing to close for attack. But these encounters were random chance, not systematic interception. The Air Ministry had experimented with searchlight cooperation, trying to illuminate targets for fighters, but searchlights could only cover tiny volumes of sky, and German pilots simply flew around them. Night fighting remained what it had always been. Futile. Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Holroyd, sitting in the corner of the operations room nursing lukewarm tea, represented a different approach. Holroyd was not a fighter pilot. He was a radar specialist, one of a small group of scientists and engineers who believed the solution existed not in human eyesight but in radio waves. For 2 years, he had worked alongside Robert Watson-Watt and the team at RAF Bawdsey, developing ground-based radar that could detect incoming raids. Chain home stations now ringed Britain's coast, providing early warning that had proven decisive during the daylight battle of Britain. But early warning was not interception. Knowing a bomber was coming did not enable fighters to find it in darkness. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected direction. In January 1941, engineers at Telecommunications Research Establishment in Swanage had successfully miniaturized radar components enough to fit the equipment aboard a Bristol Beaufighter night fighter. The device, designated AI Mark IV airborne interception, weighed 450 pounds, consumed enormous electrical power, generated tremendous heat, required constant calibration, and had an effective range of barely 3 miles. But it worked. It could detect another aircraft in total darkness and provide the pilot with bearing and range information. Theory had become possibility, but theory was not victory. The AI Mark IV was temperamental, unreliable, and required its operator to interpret fuzzy cathode ray tube displays whilst being thrown around inside a cramped, freezing fuselage. Worse, only 12 operational sets existed in March 1941. Bomber Command wanted them for navigation. Coastal Command wanted them for anti-submarine patrols. Fighter Command had to fight for every unit. Even when sets became available, installing them required stripping out other equipment, retraining ground crews, and finding radar operators capable of working the system. Most critically, the equipment had to be kept absolutely secret. If the Germans discovered Britain possessed airborne radar, they would develop countermeasures, and the brief advantage would evaporate. Wing Commander Basil Embry had pushed relentlessly for operational trials. Embry commanded No. 29 Squadron at RAF West Malling in Kent, positioned directly beneath the Luftwaffe's primary approach corridor to London. His pilots flew Beaufighters, big, powerful, twin-engine fighters carrying 4 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns. The Beaufighter was fast enough to catch German bombers, rugged enough to absorb punishment, and spacious enough to accommodate the AI equipment and its operator. Embry had hand-picked his crews, experienced pilots paired with radar operators, drawn from the small pool of specialists who understood the technology. For 2 months, they had trained, flying practice interceptions against RAF bombers, learning to interpret radar returns, developing procedures for cooperation between pilot and operator. Tonight was different. Tonight, intelligence reported a major raid forming over occupied France. Over 100 German bombers would cross the Channel targeting London's docks. Weather conditions were perfect for the attack. Thick cloud cover concealing bombers from ground observers, no moon, visibility less than 1 mile. For the Germans, ideal bombing weather. For traditional night fighters, impossible conditions. But for AI-equipped Beaufighters, cloud and darkness were irrelevant. Radio waves penetrated both. Rawnsley watched the markers creep across the plotting table toward the English coast. In 15 minutes, the first bombers would cross the shoreline. In 30 minutes, they would reach London. Ground controllers were already vectoring Beaufighters toward the estimated track, guiding them into position using chain-home radar data. Once the fighters were within 3 miles of bomber formations, their own AI radars would take over, providing precise tracking information invisible to the Germans. If everything worked as designed, tonight would mark the beginning of something unprecedented. The telephone rang. Rawnsley lifted the receiver and heard the voice of the sector controller at Biggin Hill. "First bogies crossing the coast now. 4 Beaufighters airborne and being vectored. Estimated interception in 12 minutes. Rawnsley replaced the receiver and looked at the clock. It was 2147 hours. Somewhere in the darkness over Kent, 4 British fighters were hunting targets they could not see, but their radar could. Flying Officer Edward Crewe sat in the rear seat of Beaufighter R-250, hunched over the AI Mark IV display, and tried to ignore the cold that turned his breath to fog. The aircraft bounced through turbulence at 15,000 feet, throwing him against his harness whilst he fought to keep his eyes focused on the cathode ray tube. 2 circular screens glowed faint green in the darkness, the azimuth display showing horizontal bearing and the elevation display showing vertical angle. Right now, both showed nothing but electronic noise, random speckles dancing across the phosphor coating. He was searching for a specific pattern, a bright blip that would indicate reflected radio energy bouncing off another aircraft. The intercom crackled. "Anything yet?" Flight Lieutenant Charles Widdows, the pilot, sounded tense. They had been airborne for 40 minutes, vectored by ground control toward reported bomber formations, but so far, Crewe had detected nothing. The AI equipment was notoriously temperamental. Vibration could jar components loose. Electrical interference from the Beaufighter's own engines sometimes swamped the receiver. Moisture condensing on cold components caused short circuits. And even when everything functioned perfectly, interpreting the displays required skill bordering on artistry. The difference between a genuine target return and electronic clutter was subtle. "Still clear," Crew replied, adjusting gain controls. "But ground control puts them close. Keep this heading." He wiped condensation from the screens with his gloved hand and resumed scanning. The AI transmitted pulses of radio energy forward from a transmitter mounted in the Beaufighter's nose. When those pulses struck another aircraft, some energy reflected back to receiving antennas. The time delay between transmission and reception indicated range. The strength and direction of the return indicated bearing. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was brutally difficult. Ground radar reported a large formation of German bombers 8 miles ahead. Altitude 14,000 feet, heading northwest toward London. Widows had positioned the Beaufighter slightly above and behind the estimated track, flying a parallel course. This gave Crew the best chance of detecting targets. The AI worked most reliably when searching forward and slightly downward. Range was critical. Too far away, and returns were too weak to distinguish from background noise. Too close, and the bomber might visually spot the Beaufighter before Crew could guide them into firing position. The ideal detection range was 2.5 miles, close enough for reliable tracking, far enough to remain invisible. Then Crew saw it. A single blip appeared on the azimuth display, sharp and bright, 10 degrees right of center. He adjusted the elevation control and saw a corresponding return. "Contact!" he called. "Bearing 010, range 2 miles, slightly below." His heart hammered. This was real. Somewhere in the darkness, 2 miles ahead, a German bomber crew sat unaware that death was tracking them. Widows banked the Beaufighter gently right, bringing the nose toward the bearing Crew had called. "Talk me onto him." The procedure they had practiced dozens of times now mattered desperately. Crew was the eyes, Widows was the weapon. Together they formed something unprecedented, a hunter that could see in total darkness. "Steady on 010, range closing 1.8 miles, target slightly below, not turning." Crew watched the blip intensify as they closed. The AI could not identify aircraft type, only that something was there. But intelligence reported only German bombers in this area tonight. Anything they found would be hostile. "Range 1.4 miles. He's climbing slightly. Bring your nose up 2 degrees. Widows eased back pressure on the control column. The Beaufighter's nose rose, aiming toward where the target should be. They were flying at 280 knots, nearly 5 miles per minute. At this closing speed, they would reach visual range in less than 60 seconds if the target remained unaware. Range 1 mile. Bearing steady. Target not evading. The bomber crew had no idea they were being hunted. No searchlights illuminated them. No ground fire warned of fighters nearby. They flew confidently through darkness they believed was impenetrable. "Range half mile. You should have visual soon." Crew knew the transition was critical. Once Widows could see the target visually, he would take over completely. Crew's job was to deliver the pilot to within 400 yards, close enough to see exhaust flames or the bomber's silhouette against slightly lighter sky. The AI had done its work. Now came the killing. "Tally-ho!" Widows's voice was sharp with adrenaline. "It's a Heinkel 111. I'm going in." Crew felt the Beaufighter surge forward as Widows pushed the throttles to maximum power. Through the Perspex canopy ahead, Crew glimpsed what the pilot saw. The dark, cruciform shape of a twin-engine bomber, exhaust stubs glowing dull red, completely unaware. The range closed to 300 yards, 200 yards. Widows positioned the Beaufighter slightly below and behind, aiming upward. At 150 yards, he pressed the firing button. The Beaufighter shuddered as 4 20mm Hispano cannon opened fire simultaneously. Bright tracers arced forward, converging on the Heinkel's fuselage and port engine. Each cannon fired 600 rounds per minute, 40 explosive shells per second total. The effect was catastrophic. The Heinkel's port engine disintegrated in a flash of flame. Fire streamed backward along the wing. The bomber rolled left, nose dropping, and began falling. Widows banked hard right to avoid collision as the stricken Heinkel plunged past, spinning toward Earth 14,000 feet below. From first contact to destruction, 90 seconds. "Splash one," Widows reported to ground control, his voice deliberately calm despite the adrenaline. Resuming patrol. The operations room at Bentley Priory erupted in restrained cheers. Rawnsley marked the kill on the plotting table. 1 bomber destroyed, but the raid consisted of over 100 aircraft. Other AI-equipped Beaufighters were now engaging across the sector. The radio crackled with reports. Contact 2 miles ahead. Engaging now. Target burning. Going down. 20 minutes later, crew detected a second target. The procedure repeated: detection at 2 miles, careful stalking approach, visual acquisition at 400 yards, devastating cannon fire. The second Heinkel never knew what hit it. Widows and crew returned to West Malling at 2330 hours, with 2 kills confirmed. Across the sector, other AI-equipped Beaufighters were landing with similar reports. When the night's results were compiled, the numbers were staggering. 6 German bombers destroyed in 90 minutes of operations. In a single night, AI-equipped fighters had achieved what previous weeks of conventional night fighting could not: systematic, repeatable interception and destruction of targets in total darkness. But something else had happened that night, something perhaps more significant than the kills themselves. For the first time, German bomber crews returned, reporting a new and terrifying phenomenon. Fighters attacking from complete darkness without warning. No searchlights, no flares, no visible pursuit. Simply sudden, devastating cannon fire from invisible pursuers. The Germans called it Nachtgespenst, night ghost. They did not yet understand what they faced, but they knew with absolute certainty that the night was no longer theirs alone. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Vollmer sat in the intelligence briefing room at Luftwaffe Kampfgeschwader 55's base at Villa Coublay, outside occupied Paris, and studied loss reports with growing unease. March 16, 1941, the morning after the London raid. 6 bombers had not returned. 12 aircraft were damaged, 5 severely, all reporting unexpected fighter attacks during conditions that should have made interception impossible. The reports were disturbingly consistent. No warning, no searchlights, no ground fire indicating fighter presence, then sudden cannon fire from astern, devastating and accurate. Initial reports suggested bad luck. Fighter Command occasionally achieved random nocturnal interceptions when British fighters stumbled across bomber formations by chance. But 6 kills in one night strained the definition of chance. Worse, the pattern continued. Over the next week, 13 more bombers disappeared during night operations. Crews returning from raids reported increasing anxiety. The darkness that had protected them was now concealing something they could not see or predict. Vollmer reviewed pilot statements. One particularly detailed account came from Hauptmann Josef Kamhuber, whose Heinkel 111 had barely escaped destruction over Kent on 19th March. "We were proceeding toward the target at 13,000 feet in complete cloud cover when cannon fire struck our starboard engine without any warning. I observed no searchlights, no tracers approaching from distance, no fighter exhaust flames. The attack came from directly astern at close range, perhaps 200 meters. I executed emergency evasive action, diving into thicker cloud. The fighter did not pursue. It was as though we were visible to them, but they remained invisible to us." That description troubled Vollmer profoundly. It suggested systematic tracking, not random encounter, but tracking required seeing the target. How could British fighters see German bombers through solid cloud in pitch darkness? The explanation seemed impossible, yet the losses continued. By the end of March, Kampfgeschwader 55 had lost 19 aircraft during night operations, triple the previous month's losses. Other bomber units reported similar increases. Something fundamental had changed in the night sky over Britain. German intelligence officers debated explanations. Some suggested the British had developed improved searchlight coordination, concentrating beams to illuminate targets for fighters. But bomber crews reported no searchlight activity before attacks. Others proposed that British ground radar was directing fighters with unprecedented accuracy. That was partially correct. Chain home stations were indeed vectoring fighters toward formations, but ground radar could not explain attacks occurring inside solid cloud where visual acquisition should be impossible. A few analysts suggested something more disturbing, that the British had developed airborne detection equipment allowing fighters to see in darkness. This theory was dismissed by most senior officers as technically improbable and operationally unnecessary. Germany's own attempts to develop airborne radar had founded on size and weight limitations. Surely the British faced identical constraints. But General Major Josef Kammhuber, commander of German night fighter forces, took the possibility seriously. Kammhuber had spent 2 years developing Germany's own night fighter system, based on ground radar stations directing fighters into interception zones. The Kammhuber line stretching along the coast of occupied Europe. German night fighters had achieved modest success against RAF bombers using this system, but German equipment was ground-based, bulky, and required elaborate infrastructure. If Britain had somehow miniaturized radar enough to install it aboard fighters, they had achieved something Germany considered years away from operational feasibility. Kammhuber ordered intelligence priority placed on determining how the British were achieving their kills. Interrogation of downed British aircrew yielded nothing. Most night fighter pilots and radar operators carried cyanide capsules and strict instructions to destroy all equipment before capture. British fighters shot down over occupied territory were rushed to German research facilities, but examinations revealed nothing unusual. Either the equipment was being successfully destroyed before capture, or the British were extraordinarily careful about where they risked losing AI-equipped aircraft. The psychological impact on German bomber crews was significant. Previously, night raids had been considered relatively safe compared to daylight operations. Fighter opposition was negligible and anti-aircraft fire, whilst dangerous, was predictable. Crews flew confidently, following established routes and procedures. Now, every mission carried new dread. At any moment, without warning, cannon shells might rip through the fuselage from an attacker they never saw. Morale declined. Operational tempo decreased as crews insisted on longer rest periods between missions. Some bomber groups requested reassignment to other theaters. The Germans attempted countermeasures without fully understanding what they were countering. Bomber formations began flying at higher altitudes, reasoning that if British fighters were tracking them visually using better training or equipment, additional altitude would make visual acquisition more difficult. This proved ineffective. AI radar was altitude independent. Bombers began executing random course changes during approach, hoping to shake off any pursuit. This complicated navigation and reduced bombing accuracy, but did not stop the kills. Some units experimented with rearward-firing machine guns, mounted to engage fighters attacking from astern, but without warning of approach. Gunners could not bring weapons to bear before cannon fire destroyed their aircraft. By April 1941, German bomber losses over Britain during night operations had doubled compared to the previous 6 months. The Luftwaffe High Command ordered investigation into reducing British night fighter effectiveness. Reconnaissance flights attempted to identify British fighter bases for bombing, but attacks on airfields proved ineffective. Fighters simply dispersed to alternate fields. Electronic warfare specialists searched for radio emissions that might indicate airborne radar, but AI sets operated on frequencies German receivers were not monitoring. The fundamental problem was doctrinal inflexibility. German aerial warfare theory presumed technological parity with opponents. The possibility that Britain had developed a functional airborne radar system ahead of Germany challenged institutional assumptions about German technical superiority. Senior Luftwaffe commanders resisted, accepting that a besieged island nation, outproduced in aircraft and struggling to replace losses, had somehow achieved a technological breakthrough that the mighty German war machine could not match. This cognitive dissonance delayed German understanding of what they faced by months during which British night fighters honed their tactics and AI equipment improved. One incident crystallized German confusion. On the night of 10th April, a Heinkel 111 from Kampfgeschwader 27 was attacked over Sussex and severely damaged, but managed to return to base. The crew reported that their attacker had followed them through multiple evasive maneuvers, through cloud, maintaining perfect position despite complete absence of moon or stars. The fighter had fired 3 separate bursts, each from optimal range and angle, suggesting not lucky pursuit, but systematic tracking. The crew insisted it was impossible for the fighter to have maintained contact without some form of detection equipment. Their report reached Kamhuber's desk. He attached a note. "This confirms my assessment. The British have solved airborne radar. We must assume all night operations are now compromised, but by the time German High Command accepted this conclusion, it was too late. British night fighter squadrons had integrated AI equipment across multiple units. Training programs produced qualified radar operators faster than Germany could develop countermeasures. The brief window when Germany might have adapted tactics to minimize the new threat had closed. The night sky over Britain, which the Luftwaffe had owned since September 1940, was now contested battle space, and the British were winning. The operations room at RAF Fighter Command fell silent as Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding reviewed the statistical summary for May 1941. In 2 months since the first AI-equipped Beaufighters began operations, night fighter squadrons had destroyed 96 German bombers with confirmed kills and damaged scores more. The loss rate for Luftwaffe night raids had increased from 0.2% to over 4%, a 20-fold multiplication. More significantly, raid frequency had decreased dramatically. German bomber formations now avoided areas where AI-equipped fighters patrolled. The Blitz, which had pounded British cities relentlessly for 8 months, was ending not through bomber exhaustion, but through unacceptable losses. The strategic implications extended beyond the immediate kill statistics. Every German bomber destroyed represented crews lost, trained airmen requiring months to replace. Every bomber damaged meant aircraft unavailable for other operations. More importantly, declining bomber effectiveness undermined the entire strategic purpose of the Blitz. Germany had sought to destroy British industrial capacity, break civilian morale, and force negotiated surrender. Instead, British production was recovering, morale was hardening, and the Luftwaffe was suffering unsustainable attrition. By June 1941, Hitler would redirect the Luftwaffe eastward for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Blitz ended not in German victory, but in strategic failure, and AI-equipped night fighters had contributed decisively to that outcome. Squadron leader James Rawnsley attended a quiet ceremony at RAF West Malling in July 1941, where Air Marshal Sholto Douglas presented decorations to the first AI crews. Flight Lieutenant Charles Widdows received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions during March operations. Flying Officer Edward Crewe was awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal for exceptional skill as a radar operator. Neither man could publicly discuss what they had done. AI equipment remained classified top secret, its existence unknown even to most RAF personnel. The citations mentioned exceptional night fighting skill and repeated successful interceptions, but contained no reference to radar. The men who had transformed night warfare were decorated in silence. The technological development continued throughout 1941 and 1942. AI Mark VII, introduced in 1942, offered longer range and better discrimination. AI Mark VIII followed, with centimetric radar, providing unprecedented accuracy. British engineers maintained a consistent technological lead over German efforts to develop comparable equipment. By 1943, RAF night fighters equipped with advanced AI sets were destroying German bombers at rates that forced the Luftwaffe to abandon night operations over Britain almost entirely. The balance had shifted irrevocably, but the true legacy extended beyond tactical victories. Airborne radar development accelerated adjacent technologies. Miniaturization techniques developed for AI equipment enabled countless subsequent applications. Engineers who learned to produce compact, reliable electronics for fighters later designed systems for bombers, naval vessels, and civil aircraft. The principle of cooperative operation between pilot and radar operator became doctrine across multiple domains. Training programs established to produce AI operators created cadres of specialists who transformed post-war military aviation. The war ended in May 1945. Within months, the secrecy surrounding AI equipment was relaxed, and the story of British night fighters began emerging. Journalists visited RAF stations where Beaufighters were displayed with AI sets installed. Crews who had flown operational missions during 1941 finally spoke publicly about their experiences. The narrative that emerged was compelling. Outnumbered defenders using innovation and determination to defeat a larger enemy. It became part of Britain's war mythology, alongside the Battle of Britain and Dunkirk, a story of ingenuity triumphing over raw power. Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Holroyd, the radar specialist who had helped develop operational procedures for AI equipment, received a Member of the British Empire Commendation in 1946. He returned to civilian life, joining the Telecommunications Research Establishment's post-war successor, where he contributed to civil aviation radar development. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime work, typical of the generation that fought the war. When interviewed for a 1965 documentary about RAF night fighters, he deflected credit. "We simply applied existing technology in new ways. The real heroes were the crews who flew night after night, trusting equipment they barely understood, fighting an enemy they couldn't see until the final seconds." Charles Widdows and Edward Crewe remained in the RAF after the war. Widdows achieved the rank of wing commander before retiring in 1955. Crewe became a radar instructor, training the next generation of operators for jet-age fighters. They maintained correspondence until Widdows' death in 1982. In their letters, they occasionally reflected on that March night in 1941, when they achieved the first AI-assisted kill. Crewe wrote in 1979, "We knew we were doing something unprecedented, but we could not have imagined how it would change aerial warfare permanently. We were simply trying to stop bombers killing civilians. The technology was merely a tool." The strategic assessment came later, when historians gained access to German records. Luftwaffe documents revealed the profound impact that AI-equipped fighters had on German planning and morale. Kampfgeschwader 55's war diary for April 1941 recorded, "Night operations over Britain have become prohibitively costly. We are losing aircraft at rates that cannot be sustained. The enemy has developed countermeasures that our intelligence failed to predict and our tactics cannot defeat." General Kamhuber's 1945 interrogation included revealing testimony. "We knew the British had some form of airborne detection equipment by mid-1941, but we could not develop countermeasures quickly enough. By the time we understood what we faced, they had integrated the technology so thoroughly that night operations over Britain were effectively impossible." The strategic turning point had been even more significant than immediate participants realized. Britain's ability to defend against night bombing in 1941 meant industrial production could continue, cities could rebuild, and civilian morale remained intact. When America entered the war in December 1941, they found a Britain bloodied but functional, capable of serving as the base for eventual liberation of Europe. If the Blitz had continued unchecked through 1941, Britain's capacity to serve that role would have been severely compromised. The silent hunters who began operations in March 1941 had protected not just London or Manchester, but Britain's entire strategic position. The legacy lives in unexpected places. Modern fighter aircraft carry descendants of those first AI sets, sophisticated radar systems capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously at hundreds of miles range. Every interceptor in every air force worldwide uses principles developed during those desperate nights over Kent in 1941. The cooperation between pilot and radar operator, refined through trial and error during the Blitz, remains fundamental to military aviation. When contemporary pilots achieve kills using beyond visual range missiles guided by onboard radar, they are executing tactics pioneered by men like Widows and crew who hunted blindly through darkness with primitive equipment and extraordinary courage. Perhaps most significantly, AI development represented validation of a principle that Britain exemplified throughout the war. That innovation matters more than material superiority, that determination and ingenuity can overcome numerical disadvantage, and that ordinary individuals facing extraordinary challenges can achieve things they themselves considered impossible. Those bomber crews flying through darkness over Germany had no idea they were pioneering technology that would transform aerial warfare forever. They knew only that bombers were killing civilians, that conventional methods had failed, and that they would try anything that might work. That willingness to embrace innovation under pressure, to trust unproven technology, and to persist despite setbacks, that was Britain's secret weapon. The radar set was merely how it manifested. Join us as we uncover more untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay updated on the hidden innovations and unsung heroes who changed history. Share your thoughts in the comments. What other overlooked aspects of the war would you like us to explore? Your engagement helps us bring these vital stories to light.